So the recording is on. So today's speaker is Sven Nyholm. He's an assistant professor of philosophical ethics at the Utrecht University. His main research focuses on ethics of technology, ethical theory, and history of ethics. So he has written on many things. I think the first time I saw him give a talk, it was on Kant's universal law. I was in Groningen. That was 7 years ago, but he's now mainly writing on many different things: self-driving cars, humanoid robots, autonomous weapon system. If you want to read more about his ideas, I can really recommend his Roman and Littlefield's book, Humans and Robots. So it's a really great book. Today's talk is titled Responsibility Gaps, Value Alignment, and Meaningful Human Control over AI. And I would like to give the floor to you, Sven.
Well, thanks a lot, Herman. Yeah, I am going to talk a little bit about meaningful human control, but mostly about the first two topics, because I have a paper, and so if people are interested in reading a written version of this, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I would very much appreciate any feedback people might have. So just send me an email. Can you now see my slides?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Okay, so responsibility gaps, value alignment, and meaningful human control over AI. We're going to start with Lee Sedol, who, as you will probably know, lost against the computer program AlphaGo. They played 5 games, and he actually won one of them, but the other 4 games were won by the computer program that had been trailing against itself. And so, although there was a human who was sort of moving around the pieces on the board, the guy on the left there, he didn't understand the strategies of AlphaGo, and so he was a little bit like the person in John Searle's Chinese room experiment. So if you know about that experiment, a thought experiment, John Searles imagined someone who gets instructions about how to put together messages in Chinese, and without knowing Chinese, the person can do that, but they wouldn't know the meaning of those messages. And this person who is kind of playing Go against the world champion, it's a little bit like that. He's moving the pieces around on the suggestions from the computer program, doesn't know why exactly, doesn't understand the strategy, but then the computer program won the game. Lee Sedol, incidentally, retired after this. He didn't want to play Go anymore. It felt meaningless. Another case that you may have heard of, quite different, exactly 2 years later. So Lee Sedol was beaten by AlphaGo in 2016 in March. In March of 2018, the first time it happened that a person was hit and killed by a self-driving car. So there's a pretty gruesome video of this, and so the safety driver did not react in time, nor did the AI system in the car. It classified the person first, I believe, as a road sign, then as a bike, because she was walking with a bike, then as a person, and I think it switched back and forth between classifying her as a bike and a person. An appropriate action was not taken. The safety driver did not react in time, and the woman, Elaine Hertzberg, was hit and killed and died on the way to the hospital. So people worry about not having control, not understanding AI systems. Some people even say that if we start using AI systems to create what they call killer robots, autonomous AI-driven weapons systems, this might be another case where we lose control. We don't understand what's exactly is happening in these systems, and so we cannot be held appropriately responsible, but people should be held responsible for things that are both good and bad outcomes. So we might have problems with what I will call, it's not just me, it's a commonly used term, responsibility gaps. But what I will do is to try to identify sort of 4 broad classes of responsibility gaps. At least the fourth one, I think I haven't seen people talk about before, and I will relate those types of responsibility gaps to the issue of value alignment. And then if there's time, I will talk a little bit about meaningful human control, but it's all going to be about meaningful human control indirectly, and we can discuss that more during the Q&A. So don't worry if you wanted to talk about meaningful human control, that's going to be lurking in the background throughout the talk. Okay, so I should first say what is meant by responsibility gaps more generally. And it doesn't have to be anything to do with AI. It can be with large groups of people are doing things together. There can be good or bad effects, but it can happen that maybe it's the culture of the organization. Maybe it is some other group level effect that means that it's very hard to find some individual person or maybe even group of persons who can be held responsible, but there is some outcome that you think it would be appropriate to hold somebody responsible for, and so there's a responsibility gap. And so related to AI, so if there's an AI system bringing about an effect, and it seems that it's a good and bad effect, you want to hold someone responsible, but you can't find anyone who it's appropriate to hold responsible, then we have a responsibility gap. Okay, so in order to get to my 4 kinds, I'm going to use 2 general distinctions from a more general philosophy of responsibility. The first distinction is between what I will call negative and positive responsibility. So negative responsibility, I mean something bad has happened or someone has done something bad and we want to blame them or punish them. Negative. Or something good has happened and we want to praise them or reward them. That's another way of holding someone responsible, giving them credit where credit is due, and that is what I mean by positive responsibility. Another distinction is between backward-looking and forward-looking responsibility. So after something has happened, so someone has been injured or some good outcome, someone has been saved, let's say, we might want to blame or praise someone for what has happened, but we might also think that certain people have responsibilities to take precautions to avoid certain good outcomes or perhaps to promote certain good outcomes. So looking at the future, who is responsible for making sure that things go certain ways rather than others. That's what's meant by forward-looking responsibility. So if you have these 2 distinctions and you're thinking about responsibility gaps, you can create a sort of classification matrix that would look something like this. So you could have responsibility gaps that are backward-looking and negative, forward-looking and negative, or backward-looking and positive, or forward-looking and positive. So those are the 4 kinds of responsibility gaps I want to talk about. And let me start by just kind of mapping these onto some of the existing literature. I mean, as I said, I have a paper version of this and I go into some more detail about how to kind of map the territory here, but here are just some examples. I mentioned killer robots, autonomous weapon systems earlier, and there's a famous article by Robert Sparrow that maybe a lot of you have read, where he argues that there might be responsibility gaps related to them. And that discussion is about backward-looking negative responsibility gaps. After something bad has happened, it's unclear who can be blamed. Now, and this is pretty much all the discussion about responsibility gaps is almost all about backward-looking negative responsibility gaps. So John Danaher, for example, has a paper about what he calls retribution gaps, who should be punished if there's something bad that happens and we can't find an appropriate person. In a recent forthcoming paper by one of your colleagues, Filippo Santoni, the CEO, together with Giulio Mecacci, they talk about what they call culpability gaps, moral accountability gaps, public official accountability gaps. Those are all backward-looking negative responsibility gaps. What about forward-looking what about backward-looking positive responsibility gaps? Well, John Danaher and I have written a paper about the automation of work, and it could be that if more and more work tasks are outsourced to AI systems and robots, then maybe the room for human achievement in the workplace is becoming smaller and smaller. And so there might be good outcomes So there might be an AI system that identifies something as a cancer or something like that. That's not a nice outcome, but it's nice that there's a diagnosis. Maybe the AI system can even recommend a treatment, so that something good may have happened because the disease has been found and a treatment has been recommended, but perhaps no human can sort of claim credit because it was all done by machine learning and in a way that's opaque to the people involved. So there might be kind of a gap in achievement. What about forward-looking negative responsibility gaps? Well, in the book that Herman very kindly recommended earlier, Humans and Robots, I talk about what I call obligation gaps. And so let's say that a self-driving car is out driving and it should not hit anyone, but it cannot be held responsible if it were to hit someone. And so after the fact, there might be a responsibility gap of a backward-looking kind. But if that's the case, there would seemingly also be a forward-looking responsibility gap, because it's not going to be true that if it hits someone, it can be blamed, and perhaps the person riding in the car can also not be blamed. So there's a worry that there's a gap in terms of who exactly is obligated to make sure that no one is hit. I already mentioned Filippo and Giulio, and they have another gap that they call active responsibility gaps. And I'm not sure, but I think that corresponds to what I'm calling forward-looking negative responsibility gaps. Now, the box that I am sort of most fascinated by and I want to talk most about in this talk is the last one. And as far as I know, in the literature, people have not discussed this type of responsibility gap. So who should make sure that something good happens in the future? Who is responsible for that? Now, before I get to that, let me talk about two asymmetries that I think there might be in terms of how willing people are to fill these gaps by sort of taking responsibility, by stepping forward and saying, okay, I will be responsible. First of all, I think people are quite willing to take responsibility for good things that have happened in the past, but they're quite unwilling to take responsibility for bad things that have happened in the past. That's one asymmetry that we have to deal with. And people might want to take responsibility for good things that have happened, even though they're not sort of justified because they didn't actually do anything very impressive. Whereas if people have done something bad and they deserve to be punished or blamed, they are usually pretty unwilling to be held responsible. So that's one issue here. Another issue is when it comes to forward-looking versus backward-looking positive responsibility. People, as I said, are quite willing and eager to take responsibility for good things that have happened in the past. However, when it comes to making sure that things go well in the future, people tend to be much less willing to take on responsibilities. Now, all of these asymmetries, or both of them, I think have to do with the costs that are involved in taking responsibility for something. If you take responsibility for something good that has already happened, there's just things to be gained from this. You get praise, you might get rewards, etc. But all other responsibility gaps involves taking on certain costs. Even taking on the responsibility of making sure that good things happen in the future can, for example, involve an opportunity cost, because you have to, work to make sure that the good outcome is achieved, and thereby possibly missing out on other opportunities to perhaps promote, for example, your personal interests. Okay, so it's pretty hard to fill these responsibility gaps by just expecting people to kind of step forward and take responsibility. Now, what other reasons are there why responsibility gaps arise? It's quite common to say that AI and robots can become a sort of agent of some sort. And if they're acting in an autonomous, independent way, these systems or these agents, then and humans are not able to control or predict what they're going to do, then that might be one reason why you think there are responsibility gaps. I mentioned Robert Sparrow. He gives that kind of argument in terms of when it comes to military robots. Another reason is the problem of many hands. So this is where to make one AI system or some other thing work, it sometimes can be required to have lots of different people involved performing small tasks and parts, and everyone might have a little bit of responsibility, but it might be unclear who bears the most responsibility, and so the responsibility might be sort of watered down and spread out too much over too many people, and therefore there might be a gap. And lastly, and this is what I want to talk most about, is that not only do people shy away from taking responsibility for making sure that future good outcomes are achieved, and this is to do with this empty box that I want to fill with a new kind of responsibility gaps that was down in the corner. It's also the case that common sense morality doesn't postulate as strong positive responsibilities to create a good future as it postulates responsibilities to avoid harming people. And so this is discussed, for example, by Julian Savulescu at the bottom there, and Ingmar Persson at the top, where in their book that's called Unfit for the Future, where they worry about how common sense morality might undermine our sort of abilities to meet the challenges of the modern world. They argue that we have developed throughout human evolution certain attitudes, and one of the attitudes that we have is that we feel, and I'm quoting now, intuitively responsible much more for the harm that we cause than for any benefits that we fail to cause, and that we feel also that we have moral duties and obligations to not harm, but not necessarily in the same way to benefit. And so people are, in common sense morality, sort of permitted to promote their own interests and not necessarily responsible for or required to promote the overall good. Now, what about in ethical theory? Is that the same? And what about, for example, in utilitarianism that says that we should promote the overall good? Well, actually, even if you look at utilitarians, they tend to shy away from saying that this is a sort of positive responsibility that we have. Both Bentham and Mill, for example, in their utilitarian theory say that the overall good is best promoted if everyone gets to promote their own interests, so long as they don't harm other people. And a lot of contemporary consequentialists say that a lot of the values that we have are to do with ourselves and our loved ones. And so maybe the overall good is best promoted if everyone can kind of promote their own personal interest or the interest of their children and friends and family. And so even utilitarian theories don't sometimes postulate a strong responsibility to promote the overall future good. What about Kantian ethics? Well, Kantian ethics also has a duty to promote the good, but there too Kant describes this as what he calls a wide, imperfect duty. You should have this as one of your aims, but you're not positively responsible for spending all your time on promoting other people's good. Now, I think there's an argument that we can make for why this creates a problem for AI value alignment. I think this audience will all know what I'm talking about when I say value alignment, but let me just remind you, this is the outcome where we create AI systems that promote human values that fit with human preferences and that further our interests. And when people talk about value alignment, they often talk about trying to create more and more advanced AI systems that hopefully will promote human values and the good. Now, so if it's true that common sense morality and many moral theories, they involve strong responsibilities to avoid harm, but not necessarily strong responsibilities to actively strive for positive outcomes, and AI alignment is the creation of good future outcomes, there might be a kind of responsibility gap of the forward-looking positive kind here, because again, if common sense morality and many moral theories don't say that we have as strong responsibilities to do good as we do to avoid harm, and AI alignment is a way of doing good, then there might be a kind of responsibility gap in terms of who exactly it is that should be promoting the good of AI alignment. Okay, so one way then in which we can maybe fill in this missing box is to say that the AI alignment issue, especially future-directed AI alignment of systems that we don't yet have, but we hope that someone will invent, that might be one case where we have an instance of what I'm calling a forward-looking positive responsibility gap. It would be good if we achieve this goal, but it's unclear who exactly it is that has a positive responsibility to strive towards fulfilling this goal. Okay, so now what about the literature about how to fulfill responsibility gaps? Could we somehow use that? I myself, in one paper from 2018 and also in the book, that Herman mentioned, I have argued that we can view humans and AI systems and other technologies as forming a kind of teams, and maybe the technology part of the team is not responsible, but the human parts of those teams are responsible. And who are these human technology teams? Well, we can ask questions like, who has the ability to stop the technology and turn it on and off? Who has an understanding of how it works? Who is able to update or request updates to the technology? Who is able to monitor the technology, and so on and so forth. So if we have these kinds of questions and we have a lot of the answers pointing in the direction of a certain individual or team of individuals, then we can say that those are the ones that are collaborating with the technologies and that could be held responsible. I already mentioned Filippo and Giulio. They have what they call a track and trace theory. I sometimes like to call their theory the package delivery or parcel delivery theory, because it sounds like you order something online and you're waiting for your package to arrive. The tracking condition is that the technology should track human values, and it sounds like value alignment. It should align your human interests and goals. And the tracing, I see that there's a typo here. It should be track and trace and not track and track, but that's what I meant, not track and track, but track and trace. The tracing requirement is that there should be people who understand how things work, and also the moral significance of using the technology in question. So, there's really an overlap between what I had suggested and what they are suggesting, because I had also asked, who is able to understand, at least on a macro level, how the technologies in question work, and whose interests are being, promoted by the technology. That's very similar to the track and trace conditions that they have. So I think of our respective theories as both being, variations on the same theme, basically. So those are attempts to fill responsibility gaps. But they wouldn't necessarily fill the forward-looking responsibility gap that I've been talking about, since that is to do with value alignment, and what, for example, Filippo and Giulio called tracking, that just seems to be value alignment. And so there's a question of who should bring about that tracking or value alignment. Now, what about rethinking these responsibility gaps? Well, perhaps you could, for example, say that, okay, there are not strong responsibilities to promote good outcomes, but if you don't promote good outcomes, then bad outcomes might be brought about. And so you can kind of maybe turn things around and say the failure to promote the good outcomes would bring about a lot of risks, and we do have a strong moral obligation to avoid creating harm. And so by maybe promoting the good outcome, the value alignment could be a means to the end of avoiding bad outcomes or certain risks. Now, I think these are all interesting, and in the paper that where I talk about this in some more detail, I say that these are really, they're not so much practical solutions as they're sort of theoretical idealizations, things that we can in theory do, but in practice it's actually quite hard if you apply these sort of ideas to cases like the Uber car hitting and killing that pedestrian Elaine Hertzberg, AlphaGo winning the game. How exactly these theories apply to those cases, and who's responsible, who can get credit for winning a game or be blamed for a self-driving car hitting and killing a person. There might still be a many-hand problem involved. There might be worries to do with, again, who should make sure that there's value alignment in the first place. And even if you are able to sort of, in theory, reconceptualize certain promotions of good outcomes as avoidance of bad outcomes and risk management, that still doesn't necessarily point to a particular person or set of persons. So I think a lot of the suggestions in the literature about how to fill responsibility gaps are interesting, but they're really a kind of theoretical idealizations that point out relevant features of responsibility, but that don't necessarily give us a kind of checklist for how in every case we can easily fill responsibility gaps. And again, I especially worry about what I call forward-looking possible responsibility gaps related to AI value alignment. Okay, so I have talked about some different cases. There are, bad outcomes, such as people being hit by self-driving cars. There are what you might think of as a good outcome, an AI system winning a game. Of course, in that case, it's not clear that it was actually a good outcome because, as I said, the human world champion he became so disillusioned that he quit playing Go, and so I'm not even sure that was a particularly good outcome, and that there was any what you might call value alignment in that particular case. And so I want to say that we shouldn't only talk about backward-looking negative responsibility gaps, which has been a normal thing to discuss in this literature. We should also look at forward-looking negative responsibility gaps and backward and forward-looking positive responsibility gaps. Who exactly, if anyone, deserves credit if something good is done by an AI system, but more importantly, who has a more responsibility to make sure that we create good AI systems that align with human values and not bad ones that clash with them. And since common sense and moral theory postulates much stronger responsibilities to avoid bad outcomes than to promote good ones, then we might have a interesting and confusing forward-looking positive responsibility gap here. All right, so thanks a lot. Again, if people want to read a written version of this, please feel free to get in touch with me. I would very much like to hear feedback on that too. So, but for now, I'm very much looking forward to discussing this in this version of the material with you. Thanks.
So thanks, Sven. That was really interesting. So really nice how you connected value alignment with the problem with responsibility gaps. I think that's really nice novel contribution as well. So the floor is now open for questions. I see one question in the chat by Volkert. So if you're still here, please feel free to ask your question. But maybe he's already. So are you? So I think he left. So I can read out the question, Sven, and maybe you can answer, and then we can all benefit. So the question is: when you first mentioned negative and positive responsibility, I expected it to mean responsibility that something bad does not occur, or that something good does occur. How do you think that this distinction might help in thinking about responsibility gap? It might be even more useful than thinking about the result of taking responsibility. What seems to be the meaning you attach to negative positive?
Yeah, so that sounds as if what I was calling forward-looking responsibility is what they were referring to. And it is true that some philosophers like Bernard Williams, for example, has used the expression negative responsibility gap to mean avoiding the creation of certain bad outcomes. But I mean, these are just, to me, since a lot of people more recently have talked about forward-looking responsibilities to refer to that thing, and they have mostly then talked about forward-looking responsibilities gaps of the negative kind. I see this as just an issue of terminology, but I was certainly talking about that thing that the person in question wanted me to talk about when I talked about negative forward-looking responsibility gaps.
Good. Yeah, so that's how I understood it as well. Thanks. So I think the next question is from Maximilian Kiener.
Oh yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Sven. I really enjoyed the talk. I think it was great. So I'd like to ask you about the definition and the significance of the responsibility gap to understand your account a bit better. So I think it's kind of assumed in the literature that the mere absence of responsibility is not enough to constitute a responsibility gap. So we are not responsible for the movement of the planets, but there's no responsibility gap there. And some people try to describe what else we need. And I wanted to ask you what you think is required. So the absence of responsibility and something as what is it that creates responsibility gaps? So that's about the definition.
Yeah.
And the second part of the question would be about the significance of those gaps. I mean, it strikes me that hardly anyone makes explicit why responsibility gaps, in particular the backward-looking negative ones, are problematic. So you see the just war theorists who say, well, responsibility is in some way a condition of a just war. But in other contexts, it's kind of puzzling why we should worry so much about it. Couldn't you just say, well, being responsible for bad things is a burden, and if we can move on to an insurance scheme and get rid of the responsibility stuff, wouldn't that be a good thing? So why should we worry so much about it?
Okay, great. Yeah, great question. So let me start with the first. I mean, so yes, I agree with you. Of course, it's the absence of someone who is or could rightly be held responsible. That's not enough. There has to be something more. And I think there are two main things that could happen that would make it seem as if there's a responsibility gap. The first one is that it seems that it would be right that someone should be held responsible. Because the occurrence in question may be unlike the movement of the planets or like a gust of wind or something like that. If we have technologies or even we have groups of people interacting in some way, there seems to be some sort of agency there. And this whatever happened didn't happen sort of totally accidentally. And so it just seems right to us, intuitively speaking, so to speak, that someone should be held responsible. It may also seem good that someone should be held responsible. It would be better. And people in general find it, extra bad sometimes if something happens and no one can be blamed. I mean, so this may, to some people, this especially when it comes to punishment, to some people don't like this idea. They think that we may have kind of a desire to punish sometimes. And so we feel that someone should be punished, and it would be good if someone would be punished for something, but actually it would be better to try to get rid of these kind of desires. I mean, so Steven Krajefeld has a paper where he tries to debunk the idea of responsibility gaps, because he argues that often it's driven by a kind of desire for punishment and that we should try to rid ourselves of. But it can also be on the good side. Something good happens and we think it would be nice if someone could be praised or rewarded, but we might not be able to find someone who sort of deserves it. So in general then, it seems right, or it seems good, or maybe we just want someone to be responsible, but we can't find anyone who could justifiably be held responsible, at least to the right degree. Now, then the question was, maybe we should go the sort of Steven Krajefeld route and try to accept that people are not responsible. I mean, I think sometimes it's just psychologically hard because people have a kind of strong disposition to want to find people to hold responsible. It can also be a way of achieving more, control, and meaningful human control is, one of the topics of this particular series. So the sense that things happen in the world beyond anyone's control and no one's responsible. I personally think, and I discussed this in some other work in progress, that people sort of actually value control, and they want things to be happening in a responsible way that we can, see that someone can be praised or blamed for, and it's it seems bad to a lot of people when things are out of human control. But yeah, so with individual cases, I think we can always discuss, would it actually be better to not try to hold people responsible? But that's a bigger discussion.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. If I just can say one more sentence, I guess. Yeah. Also, I agree with what you say, but I think these answers also show that we are still unclear about the value of moral responsibility in different senses. What is the value that people have moral responsibility for certain things? And there are some very, I think, fundamental discussions in philosophy, but in AI ethics, it seems to me that we still don't really understand that. But yeah, but thanks very much, Sven. It's great.
No, I agree. It's a bigger discussion, and it's, as I said, I think it has something to do with the kind of value that people implicitly put on the idea of control, but that can also sometimes go too far, and sometimes we maybe should give up some control and try to be less controlling. But I still think that people have a deep desire for control over certain parts of their lives, and responsibility has to do with that.
Okay, thanks. So next in line is Ilse.
Yeah, I basically wrote my question in the chat, saying that if you look more fine-grained into backward-looking and forward-looking responsibility, you can see that it consists of several elements. So I was wondering if you also take this into consideration in your classification.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that question can be taken in different ways. And so, for example, there's a paper by Daniel Tygard where he discusses what Gary Watson and David Shoemaker call the different phases of responsibility. So they talk about attributability, answerability, accountability, for example, and then Tygard says, well, you could also, I guess, formulate accountability, answerability, and what was the other one? Attributability gaps. And then there could also, so that's, in terms of what exactly do we want? Do we want to find someone to hold to account? Do I want someone to provide answers? Do we want someone to say that was the person who did it? That's one thing. And others would be, what exactly are the criteria? Has to do with control, with agency, with resources, etc. So yeah, so I think within the broad classes that I talked about, you can have many different things, and a lot of what people have discussed would still fall under the class of what I'm calling backward-looking negative responsibility gaps. But some of the things fall into the other classes, and again, I want to say that the whole idea of value alignment seems to fall into this otherwise seemingly unoccupied class of forward-looking positive responsibility gaps. But so, yeah, this is for a higher order discussion of broad classes, and I agree with you, Ilse, that within the classes there's a lot of further discussion, and you can sort of sub-classify within the broad classes that I presented.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question is Andrea, about on the connection with free will.
Hi, Sven. Thank you so much for this great presentation. So my question is about free will. As we all know, free will is traditionally considered a crucial element for moral agency and moral responsibility. But recently I did an empirical study, and I was surprised to see that a large majority of the people that responded to the survey actually did not consider free will as relevant for moral agency in the context of artificial moral agency. Could you provide your opinion on this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I myself think that agency is actually a very complex concept, and so with many different parts to it. And so an agent is able to perform actions, to plan things, to talk with other agents, to be held morally responsible, maybe has free will or doesn't, etc. Is able to think about sequences of actions and make plans for the future, to reflect on the past, etc. So I think these are all examples of things that we associate with what philosophers call agency. And because it's such a multi-dimensional concept, I think that means that there could be different kinds of agents. And so I do think that a lot of people think that when it comes to human agents that we have what we call free will. Of course, people mean different things by that expression. But maybe when we think about other agents, and let's say an insect, a housefly or a wasp or something like that, a bee, does it have free will? Well, maybe of some other sort, but it does seem to perform actions of some sort. And in the same way, some AI system or self-driving car can either go left or right. It comes to a fork in the road. It's very hard not to think in terms of it decided to go left, let's say. But does it have free will? Probably not. But a lot of the things that we associate with agency could still be true. I mean, it's reacting to the environment in a seemingly intelligent way that seems to be in the service of a certain goal to get to the destination. Because if you had gone right, then it would have been a detour and it would have taken longer, etc. So there seems to be some sort of agency there. But yeah, free will does maybe not seem to be there. Of course, I mean, again, free will is also one of these concepts that I think not only can it be interpreted in different ways, even within a certain interpretation, it's probably going to have lots of different aspects to it. And I don't know why some of those aspects couldn't be realized in a sort of advanced AI system. Even if maybe something like being conscious of what you're doing, which maybe I think we associate with free will, You probably wouldn't want to say that the AI system or robot is conscious. Well, but then again, I mean, consciousness too has aspects that you may be able to replicate in a technology. So I think that these are all just, it's not just like either something has agency or consciousness or free will or not. I think it's usually better to say these things have different parts to them, and technologies may be able to kind of click some of the boxes, not all of them, and have something like kind of agency, kind of quasi free will, kind of some sort of beginning of consciousness. And it's not really an on-off matter. Although when we are asked, you know, could the AI system have consciousness, we might probably going to say no. Does it have free will? We're probably going to say no. But I think when we sit down and think about it, we should be more nuanced and think that, okay, it partly has it, partly fulfills some of the conditions. That's the sort of the take I have on this.
Thank you so much.
Great. Arkady.
Yes, thank you, Sven. That was a great talk. Fascinating. I like this angle on responsibility gaps in terms of positive kind of effects. But then I wonder if you see any potential, let's call them side effects of emphasizing the need to address positive responsibility gaps. And then what the specific context that comes to mind is that it might be tempting for some people call them AI optimists to appeal to this kind of reasoning when advocating for their technological AI-based solutions to the world's problems. So do you see any parallels there? And if so, yeah, how can we proactively address that?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. Yeah, I in a way I don't like my conclusions, because I'm sort of saying that it's hard to find someone to hold responsible for creating good outcomes involving AI. And the reason for that is that both ordinary ways of thinking and people's attitudes and a lot of ethical theory are just focusing much more on negative responsibilities. But we desperately sort of need to make sure that people create good rather than bad AI systems, and we are aware of the risks that are involved. So that's why I said it towards the end, that maybe we can sort of try to rebrand some of the value alignment into value, to AI safety, AI security. So it's really a matter of avoiding bad consequences rather than positively bringing about value alignment, and that is more treated as a kind of a means rather than the end. But on the other hand, that's also not satisfying, because the reason that you would want advanced AI systems would be not as a means to something else, but as a goal. I mean, you think that AI systems that could detect cancer, I mean, in the example that I think I mentioned, and also that Scott Robbins, one of your former colleagues there in Delft, discussed in a really interesting paper from 2019 in Minds and Machines. I mean, we want these good outcomes, and so it isn't just a means for avoiding bad outcomes involving AI. And if that was only the problem, why would we want the systems in the first place? So yeah, I don't kind of like my conclusions, but I just think that there are implications of the way that philosophers usually talk about the difference between positive and negative responsibility, and also the way that people in general they feel that they shouldn't be held responsible for bringing about good outcomes for other people. They should be able to focus on themselves, maybe their children, their friends and family, and so long as they don't harm other people. And this is what Mill sometimes calls what people talk about as Mill's harm principle. Do whatever you want so long as you don't harm other people. But it might seem, well, if people are creating the systems, they should be striving towards the good, but if there's no responsibility there, yeah. So I mean, I don't really have anything good to say other than that I don't like my own conclusions, but there just seem to be implications of the way that philosophers have discussed some of these topics, and if you just put them together, you get what I was talking about, I think.
Great, thanks.
Okay, for now, the last question on my list is Art.
Yes, thanks for your talk, Sven. I'm writing my master thesis about the responsibility gap in a forward-looking way, so it really provides some useful insights for my thesis. And I was wondering, I also read about the problem of many hands from Van der Poel, and he provides us with 2 solutions to alleviate the gap. And the first one was virtue and duty based, so that sound more like the value aligned solution that you also provided. But he also mentioned that we could use some procedural approach to distribute more responsibility, for example, with the procedures of John Rawls. So I was thinking, is that also a possible way to deal with the positive forward-looking moral responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, probably. I'm not I'm familiar with the virtue idea that Van der Poel also discusses. Not so very familiar with how to apply the Rawlsian idea to this particular case, but I mean, that does seem promising. I mean, something that's maybe a little bit related that I've been toying with myself is to think of responsibility. I mean, as I said, if you're positively held responsibility after something good has happened, then it's a benefit to you to be held responsible. And some people even think that negative responsibility can be a kind of benefit because it shows that you're an important player. I mean, there's a kind of interesting case. The Norwegian mass murderer Anders Breivik was first deemed to be insane and not responsible for his mass murder, but he actually wanted to be deemed insane and to be held responsible because he wanted to be a true I don't know, fighter for his cause, and if it was deemed insane, he couldn't, be viewed in that way. So he preferred being sent to prison and held responsible to being sent to, to care and being regarded as insane. And so even with negative responsibility, people might see that as a kind of a positive thing. But in general, I think we can think about, okay, who is it that would benefit, for example, from AI technologies? Maybe the reason that because they benefit, they should maybe also be more responsible for people who maybe benefit less. And so we can use a kind of fairness reasoning. So the more you benefit from some technology, some practice, the more maybe responsibility you should take on for any outcomes, good or bad, of that practice or that technology. I think that would probably be in line to some extent with Rawlsian reasoning, and you can probably provide a kind of Rawlsian account of why that would be just or fair. So yeah, I see potential there, but although I have started thinking about this a little bit myself, I haven't looked at specifically the Rawlsian way of looking at it.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I was not really specifically about the Rawlsian way, but more the fact that you can deliver some procedures beforehand and think in scenarios in order to what can happen and then distribute the responsibility beforehand sounded like a different way of approaching it than based on the duty. So
yeah, right. Yeah, no, indeed. And then you can ask, okay, so if someone wants to, do something in some domain or develop some technology, introduce some technology, and with potentially then benefiting themselves, for any income that they might earn, etc., then perhaps the procedure should be that yes, then they also have to take on responsibility for anything bad or good that might happen, so they could get the rewards that they may create through the value that they create, but they should maybe also then internalize any of the costs or possible problems so that might be fair in a sense. So yeah, I think that's an interesting way of thinking about things.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I have a new question, Luciano.
Yeah. Sven, so yeah, thank you very much. It was really interesting and challenging to think about these different angles on responsibility gaps, and I really like the way you connected this to value alignment, for example, the tracking condition to value alignment. I see a lot of parallels. It was very nice. My question goes into this, when creating more and more AI systems, things we have also what Mark Zuckerberg was talking about, the problem of many things. So we have the problem of many hands as well, the human things, but we also have on the other side more different layers of AI agents that might interact with each other, make this kind of collaborative decisions. So how do you see the problem of many things? How in which of the boxes would that have an impact, and how do you see the seriousness of it?
I mean, I think it's a very serious problem. I really do worry a lot about the many hands and things problem here, especially with AI systems using a lot of data and different companies producing different parts of the system and different companies providing the data, etc. So there are just so many hands and things and so much data that it's almost impossible to not worry about a lot of responsibility gaps. So yeah, I mean, I think this is going to create problems in all of my boxes, basically, because I mean, it's quite different than some more old school technology, and there is maybe one producer of the technology and then one user, and it's all kind of isolated. But with AI, it's so spread out, and so many hands and so many things, as you know, as Mark Kogler is putting it. That, but yeah, I'm worried, and I think all boxes are implicated.
I completely agree with you, and it's.
I think in some of my own earlier work, I was more, optimistic about the possibility of solving responsibility gap problems. But then hadn't maybe thought enough about this problem, many hands and things, and how many different players and data sets and all sorts of things are implicated.
Yeah, great. So if I may follow up on this, Herman, can I have time? Okay. Okay. So you also when concluding your talk, you mentioned about like that this approaches, including your own, the one from Santoni and some others, they are of course not a checkbox. Like what is it? Is everything? So if I check all these boxes, I tick everything, then there's no responsibility gap. So it's not like this, of course. But do you think that we can ever get there, to get a list of checkboxes, or do you see, is this context dependent? Is this a goal to strive through according to your vision?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think it is a goal insofar as people really like it, if they can distribute responsibility to people, because we feel more comfortable when someone is responsible for something. I mean, what I had done in my previous writings about this was in a way to provide a kind of checklist of, like, if you tick most of these boxes, then you're probably responsible. The problem, though, is that, and this was something I kind of briefly mentioned, and then someone wrote a whole paper, Rose de Young, and kind of calling me out on this, that you can have different people ticking the boxes on the list. And so maybe someone understands the system, another person is the person whose interests are actually tracked, yet another person is the one that's kind of monitoring the system in real time, another person or set of persons has some other relation to, so you get again the problem, many hands coming in from a kind of another angle, even if you have a checklist, because different people may then tick the boxes. One solution then would be to say that actually what people are responsible for are much smaller things than the overall outcome. Maybe someone is responsible for one aspect of the outcome, someone else is responsible for another. But that's also a problem, because at least it's not satisfying, because people in general tend to like it when responsibility really is kind of localized. So there's one agent or maybe a group of agents who's most clearly responsible, rather than having responsibility be kind of watered down and spread out across many people. If everyone is responsible, no one is responsible, I think, is the kind of attitude that we have. So it would maybe be desirable, but it is hard in practice.
Yeah, indeed, I completely agree. Also, the diffusion of responsibility through all the layers is very complex. So thanks again, Sven. It was really interesting. Great. So I don't think there are any questions. So now I can ask my own question. Finally. So when you described responsibility gaps, you did that in epistemic terms, so that we don't know who is responsible. Where in the case where it seems appropriate that someone is responsible. So do you think that's the main kind of worry that we have or should have? Because you can also think in responsibility gaps in terms of, in a metaphysical terms, so that there should be someone responsible but no one is responsible, or more in moral terms, that not the right person or not the right collective is responsible, so the distribution should change. So do you see that as three different and relevant problems, or do you think one is much more interesting than the other? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, okay, that's a great point. I mean, so in the written version, I talk about what I call real and apparent responsibility gaps, and so I guess apparent would be the epistemic. So we think someone should be responsible, we don't know who is, and so on. Whereas real would be that actually there is no one who could justifiably or rightly be held responsible. And so it could of course also happen that we do hold someone responsible, but they don't really kind of deserve it, so to speak. Especially when it comes to, as I said, people are going to be quite willing to step forward and take credit for good outcomes. I mean, whether it's produced by an AI system or by a person, we're always eager to take credit for good outcomes. And so that can mean that we maybe think that someone deserves praise, but really from a kind of, I don't know, metaphysical point of view, they don't really. So yeah, I would agree with you that we should, this would be yet another way of getting more complexity to the, I was trying to keep things simple, but yes, you're right. The language I had been using in my written work was in terms of apparent and real responsibility gaps. Perhaps it would be clearer to talk in terms of epistemic or metaphysical or and so on. So I agree with you that this is another issue that we should be thinking about. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Yeah. So you of course introduced 4 distinctions. Everyone has his own distinctions that she likes, yeah. So distinction that you called the real and apparent. So that's at least how I interpret you. There seems to be a different thing. So sometimes there seems to be a responsibility gap, but in fact it was just an accident, for example. And if we look closer, in fact, no one is and no one should be responsible. So a self-driving car causes an incident, but it is. But when we look at it, it is an accident in a moral sense. So human beings can also be involved in accidents, and then also no one is responsible. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about, or is this again a different distinction?
Well, I actually think that's a really nice different distinction. So I think you could subdivide the apparent responsibility gaps into ones where, yeah, you're right. It actually was an accident in the sense that, you know, no one should be held responsible, but maybe we think someone should be, but we don't know who should be held responsible. And yeah, I can't remember exactly how you just made the distinction, but it's as you were speaking, it seemed to me that you can indeed take both of those and say that those are different ways in which there can be an apparent but not real or actual responsibility gap. So yeah, there's no sort of end to the possibilities in terms of how to I actually think there's a value in making a kind of a taxonomy of all of these different ways in which responsibility gaps can occur, because that just helps to show how sort of problematic this is and how many different reasons and types there can be of responsibility gaps. But yeah, what you were talking about just now seemed to me to be 2 kinds of reasons why there can be apparent responsibility gaps.
Okay, thanks. So it's 2 o'clock. Our official time is up. I don't know if you have anything. So we could. People who still have time can remain in this session if you have time, Sven, but if you have to go, that's also fine. Let me first ask you, do you have some time for some more questions? If there are any questions, or I know you're busy, so that would...
Yeah, well, first of all, before people leave, let me just say thanks a lot for those who are here and for your very nice questions and comments. I mean, this is new material and I'm very eager to discuss it with people, so I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and I would certainly be willing to hang around a bit longer if people have more things they want to discuss with me. I would be eager to hear any further comments or questions, and also you can always email comments and questions to me as well.
Sven, it was a joy listening to you.
Thanks.
Great, thanks everyone. Thanks Sven, and yeah, virtual or an actual applause. Thanks so much. So I have another question, but so if there are other people who have a question, please shout out. I will stop the recording now. That's